At 7:42 on the cold morning of March 14th, 1941, Beatrice Schilling stood on the tarmac at RAF Kenley, watching a hurricane pilot climb into his cockpit with the quiet acceptance of a man who understood his odds. The sky was pale, the air sharp, and the sound of Merlin engines carried the weight of a war that was turning against its own pilots. Schilling was 32 years old. She had spent 6 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment and nearly a year staring at the same unsolved problem. A problem that didn't just cost aircraft, it killed men. That week alone, the Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messerschmitt Bf 109s across the channel. RAF fighters met them in 27 separate engagements. 14 Hurricanes failed to return. 9 Spitfires vanished from the sky. The reports read the same every time. A British pilot sighted a German fighter, rolled into a dive to attack, and felt his engine die beneath him. The Merlin cut out. The Messerschmitt escaped, or worse, looped back and fired into a helpless aircraft, while the British pilot fought to restart an engine that had betrayed him. Schilling had read every combat report. She had studied maintenance logs line by line. She had interviewed the pilots who survived. The cause was brutally simple. During negative G maneuvers, fuel surged inside the carburetor's float chamber, flooding it. The engine starved. It died for just over a second. 1.5 seconds. That was all it took for a German fighter to close 300 yards and pull the trigger. The Germans didn't suffer this weakness. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection. They could dive, roll, invert, and climb without losing power for a heartbeat. British pilots knew it. German pilots exploited it. Squadron commanders reported it again and again. And Fighter Command was losing experienced men faster than training units could replace them. Rolls-Royce engineers were already designing a pressure carburetor, a true fix, but it wouldn't be ready until 1943, maybe later. The war would not wait. And neither could the men climbing into cockpits each morning, knowing their own engines might kill them before the enemy did. Squadron leader Davies passed Schilling on his way to the aircraft. 24 years old. 41 combat missions. 3 confirmed victories. He had reported engine failure twice in the past month, both during dives. Both times he survived on skill and luck alone. He nodded politely at Schilling. She nodded back. He had no idea she was the carburetor specialist from Farnborough. To him, she was likely just another civilian on the edge of the field. Schilling had brought something with her that morning. Inside a leather satchel rested a small brass component, precisely machined, almost absurdly simple. Her team had tested it on bench engines for 6 weeks. It worked there. But combat wasn't a laboratory. Combat was 400 miles per hour. Combat was negative G strong enough to lift a pilot against his harness. Combat was life decided in seconds. She mounted her Norton motorcycle, the satchel strapped securely at her side. Inside were 6 brass restrictors, and a plan that would either save the Royal Air Force or end her career in disgrace. The carburetor problem had begun the previous summer when Fighter Command switched to 100-octane fuel. Higher octane meant more boost. More boost meant the Merlin could produce over 1,300 horsepower. Spitfire Mk2s could now reach speeds that rivaled the Messerschmitt. But the old carburetor couldn't cope with aggressive maneuvering. Under negative G, fuel flooded the system. The physics were unavoidable, unless the flow itself was controlled. Schilling understood carburetors better than anyone at Farnborough. She had joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment just 1 month after war broke out. She was one of only 2 women in the engine department, and the only one doing engineering work. The men around her had never worked with a female engineer. Some doubted she belonged there at all. She didn't care. Pilots were dying. She had grown up dismantling engines for fun. At 14, she bought her first Norton motorcycle and tore it down to individual parts. At 25, she raced that same machine at Brooklands, averaging over 100 miles per hour, fast enough to earn the gold star. Only 3 women had ever done so. Racing taught her what stress did to machines. Sudden acceleration, violent angles, forces that gauges could never fully capture. It taught her to feel failure coming before instruments registered it. In January, the solution finally crystallized. Fuel flooded the carburetor because too much could flow when gravity reversed. So restrict the flow. Not completely, just enough. A brass disc with a carefully calculated hole. Installed before the carburetor. Limit the maximum fuel delivery without starving the engine. She machined the first one herself. A brass washer, 1/8 of an inch thick. A central hole precisely 40 thousandths of an inch wide. She tested 17 variations before finding the balance. Too large, and flooding remained. Too small, and the engine starved at full power. Bench tests proved it worked. But Schilling knew better than to trust benches alone. The problem was permission. Unauthorized modifications to frontline fighters violated regulations by the dozen. If a pilot died, she would face court-martial, possibly prison. So she didn't ask. At Kinley, she found Sergeant William Cooper, a ground crew veteran who had seen 19 pilots die from engine failures alone. He didn't ask questions when she showed him the brass washer. He simply nodded and reached for his tools. The Hurricane sat warming on dispersal. 20 minutes to take off. Cooper disconnected the fuel line, slid the restrictor into place, welded it cleanly with a butane torch. 60 seconds of work. Invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Schilling inspected the weld. Perfect. Davies would fly with the restrictor installed. He had no idea. If it failed, there would be no paperwork, no authorization, just a dead pilot and a brass washer that shouldn't exist. The Merlin roared to life. Pre-flight checks passed. Davies released the brakes and lifted into the morning sky. Schilling watched him climb. 800 feet, 1,200, 2,000. She raised her binoculars as the Hurricane banked south toward the channel. German fighters had been active over Dungeness all week. If Davies dove, the restrictor would either save him or expose her gamble as fatal. She waited. 40 minutes passed. Then an hour. At 9:37, the radio crackled. 3 Hurricanes inbound. 2 minutes out. Schilling's breath caught. She spotted them, 3 dark silhouettes against the sky, all returning. Davies landed first. He cut the engine and climbed out, pulling off his helmet with something Schilling hadn't seen in months. He was smiling. "Any engine trouble, sir?" Cooper asked. Davies shook his head. "Best the Merlins ever run," he said. Dived on 2 Messerschmitts. Engine never missed a beat. Schilling felt her knees weaken. The gamble had worked. Davies wanted to know what had been done to his aircraft. Schilling told him everything. The carburetor flooding, the negative G starvation, the brass restrictor hidden in his fuel line. She explained it calmly, like an engineer discussing equations on a chalkboard, even though her heart was still pounding. Davies listened in silence. When she finished, he turned to Sergeant Cooper. "Put it in every Hurricane on this station," he said. "Today." Schilling warned him it wasn't authorized. Davies didn't care. Authorization didn't matter when friends were dying for preventable reasons. If the Air Ministry wanted to court-martial someone, they could wait until after the war. That afternoon, Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes. Over the next 3 days, 5 aircraft flew combat patrols with the modification. None suffered engine failure. 12 diving attacks were pressed successfully against German fighters. For the first time in months, pilots dove without hesitation. Word spread faster than paperwork ever could. By March 18th, squadron commanders across No. 11 Group were calling Schilling directly. 14 calls in 2 days. They all wanted the same thing, more restrictors, immediately. Could she come to their stations? How quickly could they be made? The answer was supply. Schilling had machined 6 restrictors by hand. Thousands would require real production, brass stock, precision tooling, inspection standards. She needed official backing. She got it in 4 days. The Air Ministry fast-tracked her proposal and labeled it a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce received the contract. Production began immediately. 500 restrictors per week at first, with more capacity coming online. Installation teams would tour fighter stations and fit the devices without grounding aircraft. A critical requirement, while German fighters still crossed the channel daily. Schilling assembled a small team from Farnborough and loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and brass washers. She knew these bases. She knew their commanders. She knew their ground crews. She also knew how many funerals they'd attended. Biggin Hill was first. By the end of March, 53 Merlin engines there carried the restrictor. Ground crews worked in rotating shifts. Each installation took 12 minutes. Schilling personally inspected every weld. She rejected anything imperfect. A faulty joint at altitude meant death. Pilots watched closely. Some asked questions. Others simply nodded. They didn't need physics lectures. They needed engines that stayed alive. The nickname came quickly. Miss Schilling's Orifice. It was crude, unapologetically British, and impossible to forget. Schilling didn't object. If a joke kept pilots alive, she'd accept it gladly. By April, every Hurricane and Spitfire in Fighter Command had the restrictor installed. New aircraft rolled off production lines with it already fitted. German intelligence noticed the change almost immediately. Luftwaffe reports noted British fighters no longer breaking off dives. The advantage they had exploited was gone. The numbers told the story. Before the restrictor, engine failures occurred in nearly 40% of diving attacks. Afterward, they dropped to almost zero. Kill ratios flipped. Losses fell. Confidence returned. Pilots like Robert Stanford tuck-pressed attacks without hesitation. Others followed. The RAF didn't just survive, it pushed back. The pressure carburetor finally arrived in 1943, eliminating the problem entirely. But many aircraft kept Miss Schilling's orifice installed until the end of the war. It worked. Ground crews trusted it. Pilots trusted it. That was enough. Schilling moved on to new problems: cold weather starts, high-altitude mixtures, supercharger efficiency. Wherever engines failed under stress, her work followed. The restrictor remained her most famous achievement. A brass washer that saved lives not by complexity, but by understanding. It didn't roar. It didn't explode. It simply worked. And because it worked, thousands of pilots came home. By the third week of March, the secret was out. Squadron commanders across No. 11 Group were calling non-stop, asking the same question in different voices. How fast can we get it? Word of the tiny brass restrictor had moved faster than any official memo. Pilots wanted it installed before their next sortie. Ground crews wanted instructions. Everyone wanted the same thing: an engine that wouldn't betray them in a dive. Supply was the bottleneck. The first restrictors had been machined by hand in Farnborough. Scaling that to thousands meant paperwork, contracts, production lines. Schilling pushed the proposal through the Air Ministry with relentless precision. Approval arrived in 4 days. Rolls-Royce was assigned the contract. 500 restrictors a week at first, more to follow. Installation would begin immediately, station by station, without grounding aircraft. Fighter Command couldn't afford a pause, not even an hour. Schilling formed a small mobile team and went back on the road. Her Norton carried tools, parts, and the answer pilots had been waiting for. At Biggin Hill, the busiest fighter station in Britain, engines were modified in a steady rhythm. Disconnect, weld, reconnect, test. 12 minutes per aircraft. She inspected every joint herself. A bad weld at altitude could kill a pilot as surely as enemy fire. Pilots watched closely. Many had felt the engine die beneath them mid-attack. Now they listened as Schilling explained the physics: fuel surge, negative G, controlled flow. The simplicity stunned them. By the end of March, every Merlin engine at Biggin Hill carried the restrictor. Then Hornchurch, then North Weald, then Tangmere. The pattern repeated. Long shifts, zero failures. Confidence returning to cockpits that had grown cautious. The nickname followed naturally. Someone at Rolls-Royce called it Miss Schilling's orifice. Crude, unavoidable, memorable. Schilling accepted it with a shrug. If a joke helped pilots remember the fix that kept them alive, she could live with the joke. By April, German intelligence noticed the difference. RAF fighters no longer broke off dives. The old weakness had vanished. Luftwaffe reports mentioned aggressive British pursuits that didn't falter under negative G. The advantage had shifted. By mid-April, more than 2,000 Merlin engines had been modified: frontline fighters, reserves, training aircraft. New Spitfires rolled off the line with the restrictor already installed. The results showed up in the numbers. Before the fix, engine failure plagued more than a third of diving attacks. Afterward, it was nearly non-existent. Losses dropped. Kills rose. Pilots pressed their attacks with confidence instead of caution. A small piece of brass had altered the balance of the air war. The pressure carburetor would arrive in 1943, a complete and elegant redesign. But conversion took time, hours per aircraft, and time was the one thing Fighter Command never had. Many aircraft kept the restrictor until the end of the war. It worked. Crews trusted it. That was enough. Schilling moved on to the next problem, then the next. Cold weather starts in the Arctic. Fuel icing. High-altitude mixture control. Each challenge landed on her desk, and each solution quietly saved lives. She worked while her husband flew bombing missions over Germany. They didn't talk about the war at home. They understood it too well. After victory, recognition came without fanfare. An OBE, a handshake, then back to the lab. She stayed at Farnborough for decades, working on missiles, braking systems, aerodynamics. Always practical, always precise. Titles mattered less than solutions. When she retired, the world remembered her for a washer no bigger than a coin. Museums displayed it behind glass. Engineering schools taught it as a lesson in elegant design under pressure. A reminder that brilliance doesn't always arrive with complexity. Sometimes it arrives with a hole drilled just right. Beatrice Schilling died in 1990, leaving behind engines that no longer failed in the moment that mattered most. She hadn't flown the missions. She hadn't fired a shot. But she gave pilots something just as powerful, the freedom to dive without fear. A war is won by many hands. Some hold guns, some hold wrenches, and sometimes one holds a small piece of brass and changes everything.